1967, and this is my dad, Winston Smith. He was born in 1944, and his mother, Hortense, who was born in 1922, and Stuart Smith, who is her brother-in-law. When Hortense was 21, she was married to my grandfather, who was an officer in the Navy, correct? Stop me if I'm wrong.
She was the chief Navy chief.
He was a Navy chief, and she had one son, Dell, and when he was born, Clyde came home to visit, and she got pregnant with Dad. But Clyde died in the war. He was shot down by a German U-boat before Dad was born. And Stuart is Clyde's brother, and he was also in the war, and he's going to tell us some stories about it.
Spotlight
Yeah,
and sports.
You can just start from what you did during the war. How old were you?
Well, when I joined the Marines, I was 20. And are we still there?
Yeah.
Well, and I was in the Marines for 15 months, and then I had the good sense to ask to be commissioned as a Navy officer rather than a Marine officer. And it was the right time to do it, because when I was in the Marines, it was the Battle of Tarawa. I don't know if they killed almost all the lieutenants.
Which you would have been.
See, the Marines had a little different setup than the Army. They lieutenants led the platoons, and the Army had the sergeant leading the platoon. So then I became a Navy officer, and my training then was in what they called at that underwater demolition teams. They were kind of a forerunner of what's now called the SEALs. We basically did all of our activities under the water. Typically, we never went deep. I never was allowed to go more than 35 feet because of our equipment wasn't set up to go. We weren't pressurized. We breathed through tubes that went through a charcoal filter, and then you breathe your own air returned. And so it was fine for an hour or so, but if you were under there 2 hours with breathing your own air again, you got so sick from that carbon dioxide you had to come up.
So you had to do your job fast.
Well, it was all set up that way. We worked in 6-man teams, and we would go in usually just 3 or 4 hours before an invasion. In dark, naturally, and we would go in at. See, the Marines always landed, or even the soldiers, wherever it was, at high tide, and that was when they calculated one thing. Because they couldn't get those landing boats in far enough that they did it at low tide. And we would go in and attach plastic explosive to the obstacles the Japanese would put in the water. And
What were they, like mines and stuff?
No, they're plastic explosive. Just like a bread dough.
No, what
What did the Japanese put in the water?
Railroad rails, just like the rail on a track.
To hit the ship and make a hole?
Yeah, they would set it in cement at low tide, and it would point out to the ocean where the Marines would be coming in. And when those landing boats would hit those, they couldn't get off. They're coming in, full bore. To drive them up on the beach, and they'd hit those.
And hang them up.
And then the Japanese would have mortars set up on the hills around, and they shoot looks like a small bomb that goes up and down and they would focus those in on those rails because they know that's where the boats would be. Well, our job was to put plastic explosive on those rails, and at a given time blow them all up for a mile or two along the beach. There were several teams, and we had an explosive cord. It wasn't a fuse. And
Primer.
Primer cord it was called, and it would go off instantaneously. The plastic explosive would blow. So maybe you're 600 feet away from that, and you press your igniter, and the whole thing goes. It's kind of weird. They couldn't use regular fuse, because it wet would put the fire out.
Mm-hmm.
And then.
Tell them how they picked you up.
Well, then.
Yeah.
Tell them how you got out of the area once you put the explosive.
See, now we're all out there, maybe 600 feet from the and we together in sort of groups of teams, you know, 6, and then a high-speed boat would go roaring by, an American boat, and it had a big rope ring about 4 feet in diameter,
Down there off the side.
and it drug on the water, sort of, and when you went by, you hooked your arm into it. If you missed, they wouldn't go back.
You're kidding.
No.
You better not.
Well, they couldn't because the Japanese would have them zeroed in too well by now. So, and then they would
Hard
give
to
Make
us,
sure you're in the
arm,
right
there's a lot
spot.
of
Oh, yeah, well,
dislocation going on.
it was awful. I never knew them to miss anybody. When people were really sure they got it. And then they would take you back aboard the transports where the Marines were. They were already unloaded, and they were traveling in circles, or waiting for us. And as soon as that blow was complete, here they came.
Landing craft shot
You know,
in there.
thousands of Marines coming in on these landing craft. The landing craft that they were using where I was held 36 Marines in full gear, you know. And then they'd come in and drop that ram, and the Marines would run off. And
Now, where were you though?
Okinawa.
Okay.
That was the only regular landing I was in the war, was one at Okinawa. It was a big one. We landed along there for 30 miles or so. I mean, there was a lot of, we landed over 100,000 Marines.
Were you in the service before the war, or you just got into
I
the
joined in 1942, joined the Marines. But they didn't call me up for a while.
Okay.
And I was in an officer training because I'd had 3 years of college. And
So you pretty much went straight into the war though, as soon as you.
yeah, what happened
Went
was
to Northwestern.
my brothers, Clyde and Stanley, were both, like I say, and they said, for God's sake, whatever you do, try to get the commission. Every letter I'd get from both of us, be sure that you get in a program where you're going to be a commissioned officer. And that was what I did. So anyhow, then we would go back aboard the ship, and the Marines would be charging in. That's where they could have been soldiers, but mostly where I was always Marine. And then the next group, they would send us back ashore then, and we would be what they call beach masters. We would have flags that would stick in the sand and tell them where to land what, because you got to have quite a follow-up of shells and guns and all this sort of thing. So that's how they did it.
So you went up there amidst all the Japanese and stuff
Well, no,
flags.
fortunately, the Japanese are driven back into the hills. You counted on the Marines.
Still might be a burp in there.
That was what happened, you know.
He had a little bird.
The people who trained me were the ones who went in. The officers that trained me when I was in were the ones that got killed there at Omaha Beach, and there the boats couldn't get into the beach. There was sandbars out there that nobody had counted on. They would hang up on those sandbars, and the Germans just really killed it. I was watching that film, Saving Private Ryan. I saw one of my officers that trained me get killed, his head blown up. It was real shots, you know, that in Saving Private Ryan.
Oh, I didn't realize they put real shots in there.
Yeah, they put film.
There was about
shots in.
20 minutes of the landing.
Oh.
And
We had a friend that was in the landing, real close friend. He was like 18. He stormed the beach. He went back for the 50 year.
well, the French, they'd invited him back.
Yeah, they treated
Well,
him.
then after that, we started training for the landing on Japan. We assumed, and so did everybody, that we were going to have to land on Japan and take it physically. The Japanese, wherever I was, never surrendered. I never was around where any Japanese surrendered. They would get killed before
You talk.
Keep talking.
I couldn't pick him up. I can't pick him up with this thing.
Well,
Sorry.
so they started training us on some Pacific islands, as they were called, like the Caroline Islands. We started training to land on Japan. Well, about that time, they dropped the first atomic bomb on the Hiroshima. And, of course, didn't mean anything. I never heard of it before. We got an intelligence report. All the officers get every week an intelligence report, but they don't always tell you what's happening. Never mentioned that, of course. So then about 5 days later, they dropped another one at Nagasaki. And they really didn't know how much damage it was going to do. Nagasaki was a seaport where they made Japanese submarines, one thing. And so they took my crew and I up at Nagasaki. The war was still going on, and dumped us off there, and we went in to see how much damage had been done.
And didn't y'all take a cord or something to make sure nothing was under the water for the ship?
That's what I was to do. I went under the water, see, to make sure there were no sunken things to keep from land. We thought we were going to have to land Marines there.
And it was 6 of y'all doing that?
Well, there weren't, the funny thing about it, we hadn't sunk any Japanese ships in the way there. The submarine factory, shipyard had been bombed, but the atomic bomb, that town, which is maybe a town of 250,000, something like that, hadn't been really hurt yet. But the nuclear bomb just, man. When I came ashore, you could look as far as you could see, and there was nothing but piles of, it looked like sand
Dust.
and cement and just all broken up. What it did, the atomic bomb, was raise the town up in the air maybe half a mile and drop it back down.
Gracious.
And the only thing that was left standing substantially was the big Catholic. See, that's where the Catholics were allowed to go in and set up a cathedral there. The Portuguese were allowed to in 1560 or something. And it had walls about 10 foot thick. And it was about a mile away, because there was another officer with it. We walked over to that, scared to death. Because we didn't know whether there were Japanese up in the hills going to kill us. I think we went.
How many people were on shore with you?
6.
And they were all frogmen.
Yeah. And so just he and I though went up to that cathedral, and we got. It looked like it was perfectly preserved, but we got there. You went inside, and there was no roof. It had sucked the furniture out of the inside, everything like that. But the walls are about 10 foot thick of stone, and it didn't hurt them.
Huh.
And then we went back. We actually stayed that night. God, that's where I really got. So I killed all my men, as you probably know, from cancer, radiation. And we had sleeping bags, and we slept. We actually slept on. There was a pier there, but it was covered with dust. With
radioactive
dust, because we didn't know about that. My roommate on the ship was the ship's MD, ship's doctor, and I asked him when I knew I was going there. I said, "What's it like? Is it going to be dangerous?" And he said, "Not necessarily Japanese lie." He didn't know about radiation either.
And so you're the only one of those 6 that's still alive now. And did they die? How soon after the incident?
Well, the last one that I knew died out. It took him about 10 years. He was the other officer. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't see what happened. Was as soon as I had found out, was several years later, I get these splotches all over my skin, and they were like these, except they're all over, like in my. And it was from the radiation, but I didn't know. And I knew I must have cancer of some kind because I couldn't quit coughing. I didn't smoke or anything, so I went to see several doctors, and they couldn't find him. But the next doctor I went to had been a Navy surgeon. He examined me. He said, "Where did you get such a heavy dose of radiation?" And not thinking, I didn't know yet that the other guys had died, because they were all East Coast, and I was the only one from the Northwest. And I said, well, I was at Nagasaki. He said, "Oh my God."
Now, didn't you say before the ship came in after you and those other 6 or other 5 got off and spent the night? The ship came in later?
Yeah, later, and they landed 300 Marines.
And did most of those 300 Marines die? Oh, it was several days later.
It killed a lot of people off the ship. I don't know about the Marines, because they keep that stuff. It killed a lot of this from radiation, the sailors on the ship.
Did they ever get on land there, or were they still on the ship? So even just being out on the ship, it killed a lot of them.
Yeah.
Didn't you say at your last reunion like half of them had died already?
That's about what we figured. About half of them had died.
How many years after?
Well, you see, I don't know, because we didn't have a reunion for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have the reason. The guy who wanted to start the reunion, he was a president of a manufacturer's Hanover Trust in New York. He decided it'd be time to have a reunion. This is maybe 20 years had gone by, and so he got a hold of the Navy. See, the Navy keeps a record of all their officers anyhow, and he wanted to know the addresses, the last known address of all the people on the ship. And they told him no, they wouldn't give them to him because if they wanted to get in touch with him, they would, that they had the right to privacy. But what it was they knew damn well that they had all died like flies and by then, but it wasn't public information yet. And then luckily he hired as a vice president of that bank he was in, a high-ranking naval officer, like a four-striper that just retired from the Navy, pure personnel. And he was telling him that story. He said, I can get those names right. So he did. That's how we all got together. And it was the first time we realized.
And when was that?
About 70. It was a good 20 years afterward.
And now the thing that you're going into to Carolina for this weekend, is that the same
It's
group?
every year, except that
Oh,
now
it's every year.
there were 44 officers aboard the ship. And now there are 2 of us left alive. And he'll be there because I phoned him. And there are about 30 enlisted men.
Now, when y'all slept, I'm going back to sleeping that night on the pier. What did you do then? I mean, did you have radios to tell them back, call back?
We did, but you weren't supposed to do it unless it was emergency.
And there weren't any people anywhere.
But we never saw any Japanese. But we stood watch. One person stood watch there. We changed every 2 hours. There were 6 of us.
You didn't see anybody there then? Just
It was kind
rubble.
of eerie.
Yeah.
And like I say, there was what Japanese were. You smelled though. It stunk like hell. So you knew that there were a lot of dead parts. They blew the bodies apart, and you couldn't have recognized them if they were there.
Mm-hmm.
And
did you just spend the first night there?
yeah,
And then how did you get back on? Did the Marines take you
high
back
speedboat. It's funny when we were going to take off in that boat. We were out about, I'm guessing now maybe 30 miles. We were a long ways out. A Japanese boat started to approach us. Japanese speedboat type of thing. They were probably curious. Of course they'd had a terrible wound. They were probably just confused as hell. Mm-hmm. And so we shot at it and shot a hole in the side. We didn't try to kill them or anything. And then they turned around and they went as fast as they could back to shore.
So they came from where you were?
They came from the land. See, we were out of it. It was like going into a pier, let's see. I was trying to think. It's like going into a harbor. See, the harbor, sides of the harbor, just like I suppose Norfolk, are it's a long ways to the back of the harbor, and that's where we were heading. Ground Zero was the back of that harbor. Where I went ashore was right at Ground Zero, and that's where the submarine shipyard was. But you couldn't recognize it as a shipyard.
So these people came from somewhere beyond the harbor and had come out?
They were probably out around the mouth of the harbor somewhere, which would be, again, maybe 20 miles away from where the bomb hit.
So 20 miles away, people were still living then? It was about a 20-mile radius?
They might have died, but they didn't know they were sick either.
Right, of the radiation.
In radiation, you don't feel sick. I didn't know anything was wrong with me. Mm-hmm. And you just don't feel anything. And I don't know how many. I would guess that that bomb probably killed maybe 100,000 Japanese, but also another 100,000 were all sick. You didn't necessarily die, but you got a lot of growths like tumors type of thing. Mm-hmm. They might not be cancer.
Right.
Mine happened to work, or they're in my throat. But my men all died from leukemia. And that was the killer from the from radiation. I, of course, didn't know that either.
And now, but the thing in your throat, you never had any signs of the leukemia then. You had different kind of tumor in your throat.
Right.
But they think that's probably related to it.
Well, they knew it was. I had to do that to get a pension. They had to. They knew it was. But in the beginning, they played games. When all I wanted to do when I first started getting these big doctor bills, I wrote the Veterans Administration asking for medical help to pay those doctor bills, because the doctor told me I got them from radiation, probably in Nagasaki, because that was the only place I was. And they wrote back saying, "You can't prove you were there." Well, I had a hell of a time proving it, but you know how I proved it was I phoned my roommate, who then had become a force driver, and he was still in the Navy, and I told him that they said I went there. He said, "Well, I know where your records are, and I had to treat you if you remember when you got back on the ship, and it tells about that in your record." And so he got them for me. They were mothballed on the James River. You know where it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good thing you knew the right people afterwards, or else you wouldn't have gotten
You know,
it
that
right.
was, well, you even got, and this went on for some time. They would say, "You can't prove you were there." Well, finally, when I was able to do that, then they'd say, "You were there less than 24 hours. How could you have been radiated?" See, they'd lie on it. And if I was there 24 seconds, of course, I'd have been radiated. Just it didn't have, the time had nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, and anyhow, we went through that, and then finally, I would write letters, and I had to deal with the Atomic Energy Commission too, because they handled all nuclear cases, you know. And they would poor mouth me to be done. Well, and one time they sent me a letter, said, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself trying to screw the government out of money for," but we had gotten the congressman from my district had moved out where we lived in Edmonds' office. No congressman district probably covers, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 people. And I didn't know him, but I knew who he was, and his secretary was a friend of mine, and I happened to be talking to him, and he introduced me to the congressman. His name was John Miller. He was a young Jewish congressman who was he was a TV newsman in Seattle before he ran for Congress. Well, and I told him he said, "Well, is there anything I can help you with?" Which is typical of him. And I said, "Well, I don't know, but I've been having really trouble with the Veterans Administration overpaying my medical bills and stuff." He said, "Well," I gave him a rundown of basically what was happening. He said, "Well, give me a copy of the letters that you received from them." And they were mostly poor mouth, and they said, all this stuff. Just like the Agent Orange guys in the Vietnam War, I think. And so about 30 days later, I got a letter from the VA. And they said, "We made a mistake."
Oops.
The Congress said, "I probably can't help you, but at least I'll look into it." And that's important.
Mm-hmm.
If they look into it, then they say, "Oh, God, we're going to get caught up." They knew they'd done wrong, of course.
Well, how many boys are in your family?
4.
4 boys, and one was my grandfather.
Yes.
And he flew. He did something in the airplanes.
He was a chief AP, I think they call him. He was the plane captain on the plane, and he had been a regular sailor before he went to Pensacola, I think it was. He was on a ship with my other brother Stanley, and the ship was one of the heaviest hit ships in the war, but Clyde had gotten off and gone back here. Probably went to the Naval Air Station here in Norfolk at the time.
And Dad's told me he flew a bunch of missions, and they had shot at the U-boat the first time and injured
They
them.
injured it, but they made a mistake of going back and
Trying to get them good.
they didn't know there were 3 subs. And the one that they bombed and shot sunk. But the other 2, you know, the Germans had great anti-aircraft guns. They had what they call a 70-70, same the gun they had on the tanks. And of course they had a scored a direct hit on the pilot's compartment, and down they went. Killed all of them, of course. I was in the Marines then, and I remember getting the telegram. I think it was probably more tense. I couldn't hardly believe it. I think she said he was missing in action, because that was the term they used, and I thought, well, Germans probably captured him. We'll see him after the war. But then, when the truth came out, of course, because they did eventually, as you know, your dad got communication with the submarine commander of the U-boat that shot him down and killed him.
Right, and he actually found a picture of the other submarine trying to put the people from the sinking submarine onto them.
Yeah, I've got that picture. Your dad gave it to me.
And, I forgot what I was going to say. I'm trying to get this light to work right.
Then my brother Stanley was also a Navy chief, but he was a fireman. You know, in other words, that was a term they used for people that the ships that had what do they call them? Turbines. They didn't shovel coal. They weren't that kind of. They burned actually oil, and that generated electricity usually off the turbines, and then they used that to drive the ships. At least that's what my ship was. And his ship had been into Pearl Harbor, but had just gone out. He was on the Pensacola, which was a heavy cruiser. And then there were the first Navy part of the war, where the Navy actually got to shoot back, was the Solomon Island campaign. The most noted place was Guadalcanal and Savo Island. They just had terrible fights with the Japanese Navy. And his ship got hit hard with a Japanese, either submarine or bomb, I can't remember which, and they had to lock the engine room down. They dog them down airtight so it won't drown the people that aren't in the engine. Those that are down there, they can't get out, they're dead. They're
I want something.
Go tell Grandma. Grandma, could you
and he got wounded. But and his ship was just in one goddamn battle after another, maybe 10 or 12. Because then they were fighting with the Japanese ship later on. They didn't see each other. See, they're shooting. Their planes are taking off and bombing up.
Well, come sit down. Come here.
No, I
Okay. Sorry.
And well, finally he got to come home. But of course, in those days they sent you back. He came home and married a girl. I had met the girl. I liked her. She was a nice woman. But she naturally wanted a house and a family and a normal life, and he was shipped back out. But they still hadn't. They were still getting along. And they finally, this was several years. My ship pulled into Norfolk. I looked out. There was Stanley's ship right next to him. I hadn't seen him for years. And so
Because y'all had both just been in the war in different places.
so yeah, that's right. And he was in a different kind of a war. See, my ship was strictly involved in landings and that type of thing, and hand-to-hand type of fighting. And his ship was involved in naval duels. You know, they might not have ever seen the plane they were shooting, or the ship they were shooting at. It would be over.
What about Burton? Was Burton the other brother?
Well, let me finish on this.
Oh, sorry.
So anyhow, I went down to that ship, recognizing it was Stanley's ship. I had would get left. And I went down. I said, "Is the engineering chief Stanley Smith there?" And the officer of the day said, "Yeah, he's down." And the commander or whoever was, it would be a commander probably, who was the chief engineer officer, his commissioned officer. And I went down there both drunk as hell, sitting in his stateroom drinking. So I invited him. I said, "Why don't you come back aboard my ship for dinner tonight?" And he said, "Well, you know, I'm not allowed to go in the officer's dining room." But I said, "Well, that's fine. I got a uniform. It'll just fit you." And so he came in as a lieutenant. God, we'd have both got our asses if anybody would have known that. But anyhow, then I got a hold of Hortense. And Hortense and I and Stanley and his wife, Maria, was there. And they went out a couple times, like to dinner and stuff. They had rented a little apartment, I think, over around Portsmouth.
Was your ship being repaired, or how did y'all get time?
We ran aground out here a little bit. We just hit the ground and it kind of stuck because it's muddy bottom. It didn't do any damage, but we had to go in to see, and we were in for maybe a week or two.
Okay.
Then we went back out. But
Now, was that before Grandma and Clyde were married?
no.
They were married, but
you
Joe
you
wasn't?
saw that picture of me holding.
Oh, okay. So Dad was born then.
Yeah,
So Clyde had already been shot down. Okay.
yeah. I think that was Dell in the picture, though, not Dad. Isn't it?
Is it?
I'm not sure. I think maybe I stayed all night over to her folks' place. That's where she was living. I can't remember how long. Well, now get back to Burton. Well, then I went up when I went back out in the Pacific, and I still, because of my age, I couldn't get out. They needed officers to haul back from the war, but they sent me to China as a plastic explosive technician to Shanghai, because that's what we did in the underwater demolition. So they sent me to Manchuria, which was awful. It was, 30 below zero. Every morning you saw dead Chinese laying around frozen to death. And it was awful. See, the Chiang was fighting the communists, the Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong. And I stayed there until the communists whipped the Chinese nationalists so bad we just got on the ship and left. Because we were driven back. We weren't up in the interfacing. We were just advisors how to do stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then I came back, and the plane flying home, my wife was the stewardess. She was the first white woman I'd seen, and I married her. And then she was the mother of my 2 kids.
Huh. I never knew that. I never heard that.
The funny thing about it, there was an officer sitting with me, which I didn't know. And he was trying to get a date with her. In those days, there was one, there were DC-3s. They'd only take 21 passengers. And they had 2 stewardesses. And they had to work their butt off. But they did, everything. They had to cook the meal, sort of, and all that sort of stuff. Well, anyhow, he got a date with her. And when we got to Seattle, the date was for maybe 2 nights later. And I heard him making all that date. And then she was giving him her phone number, I think it was. And so I got out in Seattle and went to a hotel and stayed. I had to go to the Naval Hospital there. And I phoned her up. I got out and I phoned her. I said, my friend couldn't go. He's not going to be able to go. So how would you consider going out with me? So we did, and we did. In the Seattle Times, they had a story in the paper about that. Well, partly because when I introduced myself, she was telling the guy she wished she had a comment. Her name was KJOS, it'd be pronounced Chos, but people would call it Kajos, She said, I wish they had a simple name like Smith. And I said, well,
helped her out with
my
that.
name. But anyhow, we were married for a long time. Till 1975. Although we were separated for a couple of years.
Did you say what Burton did?
Oh, Burton lived with Hortense and Clyde here before Clyde went on the fatal flight.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know why he went back with Clyde and your mother. When they were out the last time was about 1943. He went back with them then, and he was still in high school.
Oh, so he wasn't in the war.
He was, yeah.
He was?
He was. But in 43, then he probably got to be, whatever, I don't know how old you were when you got drafted. It was either 17 or 18. So he got drafted from here, because they'd probably used up the draft age people around here. He got drafted in the Army, and he was the only one that wasn't in the Navy. And he got drafted, and the funny thing, what the hell was I doing I was in New York, and we got together in New York, and then he shipped out the next day or two for France. He did. I guess he landed at Normandy, yeah, and then he fought across, and then he landed. Some of the real tough war was called. It was a winter campaign. I don't remember what they called it. They had a name. It was one of the main battles where the Germans thought they had it won. It was in northern France. The Germans came in camouflage snowsuits and tanks, and the Americans didn't notice until it was almost too late.
Hey, Dad.
Dad.
What was the battle in northern France?
The big one that Burton was in the wintertime.
Out of the bulge.
Battles of the Bulge. And then from there after they finally won that, it was a hell of a time. Because they couldn't call in the planes to bomb the Germans because it was the snow and the fog was so deep they couldn't see the ground.
He shot a German, he said.
Yeah.
You got that over there?
What?
About Burton killed one.
Close by. He challenged the German. See, the German he thought was an American first. He said, "What's the password?" And the guy didn't have it, so Burton shot it. Well, then he went across the Remgen Bridge. Does that mean anything to you? It was the only bridge across the Rhine. The Germans hadn't got a chance to blow
Bridge
it.
at Ramallah, wasn't
Yeah, Ramanden.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they got there enough that the Army engineers was able to get on and defuse the bomb. God, I'd hated to have that job. You didn't know when the lever was going to be pulled. And so they actually got across the Rhine, and a whole lot of troops got across the Rhine because, of course, they defused it. But it was damaged enough somewhere along the line. They built another bridge right away. But those bridges are made of pontoons that the Army's good at that. The engineers, the Rhine's a big river. You know, God, it's like the Mississippi. It's not a little river you cross. But anyhow, then they went. He didn't go to Berlin. He went across through the Black Forest area. I think it's that area called. What's black in German?
Of course, the Black Forest.
But it was the Black Forest anyhow. They didn't call it. They called something else. And then they finally got to one of those Jewish death camps, north of Austria, and God, he was telling me about that. I guess that was awful. He said they could smell it for 40 miles away from the dead bodies. The Germans didn't get a chance to get rid of all of them. And they finally joined up with the Russians anyhow, to make a long story short.
So did he go up to the camp? Did he actually see the camp? And what did he say about that?
Well, you know, between him killing that kid and he's a psychological mess. If you probably noticed that from talking to him. Probably he really got hurt more from the war, not be killed than any of us. Well, then he came. My mother died in the meantime, and he didn't know it because he didn't know it till he came back from the war, knocked on the door. Where's Mom? My dad, of course, was there. I was still in the Pacific.
Did you know?
Yes.
How did you know and he didn't?
Just sent me a telegram. It was a little different, you know, when you're on a ship, you're in a stable community, so you can get telegrams and messages like that. Where when you're in the infantry, hell, you're in one place around there.
And you got a battle on.
Yeah, you're protecting your ass.
Mail's not what you're worried about.
That's right.
Put that on there again. Say that again. I didn't say it.
Well,
Have the tape on.
you know, of course, I knew my brother had been killed in the ocean, and first time I saw the ocean is when I was sent there to do that underwater demolition training. And I remember walking down to the ocean. It was dark and cold. And I stuck my hand in the water and said, "Hi, Clyde." Hoping he would know. Anyhow, I was very fortunate in the war, much more so than my brothers. Well, the most dangerous thing I was really in was Nagasaki.
Which most people would call the most dangerous part of the war. So. But that's a valid point, that maybe the most dangerous part of the war isn't the psychological aspects of it are worse. How you handle it later.
The Saving Private Ryan, a movie, was a disaster for me because of that 20 minutes they had of the frogmen going in there. I'm going to stay and talk to her, and they're going to come back. So, where did we leave off? We leave off with Burton.
Mm-hmm.
coming home. Well, the,
Did he tell you more about getting close to the concentration camp, or?
he told me how bad it was. Of course, the Germans had pulled out maybe several weeks before and just left it rotting sort of there. And the townspeople, I mean,
So where were all the living Jews? Were
I
they
don't
still
know.
in the camp?
They
They were
probably
gone.
were smart enough to get the hell out of there. I don't know.
So the Germans left, and they just left the other
And the
people there.
townspeople, of course, the people didn't. It wasn't right in town, but the people in the village around said they didn't know anything about it. Well, Burton said he could smell it 30 miles away. Well, anyhow, it's kind of an interesting thing because later on in my life, a far-right Protestant came in and set up a pro-Nazi camp, sort of. You probably heard of it. It was at Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, at northern Idaho.
When was that?
He set that up probably in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
He was, I think, a Baptist minister. His name was Butler, anyhow, Reverend Butler. And he had a radio program, and I can remember hearing him on the radio program say that those concentration camps where they burned and killed the Jews was strictly Jewish propaganda. It didn't happen. And that was one of his main things, that all the things he blamed on the Nazis weren't true. And I tried to get to him telling he's a damn liar because my brother was there at one, but I never made it. They finally, in order to raise money, because they weren't having a little trouble, they started that group robbing banks, you know, to make money. Well, then I brought in the FBI, of course, and they caught a few of them, and they also usually killed the people in the bank. What did they call that group? They were a Nazi group. They got a lot of publicity though, nationally. They had several hundred acres, and they were making it into a training camp, sort of. And they marched on the 4th of July, because they had to let them march, apparently. You can't.
The right to speak.
Yeah, you can't. Freedom is, yeah. But it got to where they were less and less, and well, finally, somebody got smart enough to sue them in civil court. And the court ruled in favor of them. They got all the land and all the buildings, threw them out. I thought that was really great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it ruined that far right. It was sort of like one of those. You know who Reverend Jones was? That poisoned all those people in British Guiana.
Mm-hmm.
It was a group sort of like that, where this magnetic speaker. And I wonder how those people some of them must have had relatives, friends, husbands who were killed by the Nazis. I'm surprised that people buy that.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose Goebbels, who was the Germans' propaganda minister, used to say, it's easier to believe a lie than the truth because you can doctor a lie. The truth is bare out there. And the other thing is remember, you repeat it often enough, it becomes the truth. And that's the way German propaganda was. When I was a high school kid, they were always on the Pathé News. You probably were too young for that, weren't you?
Yeah, she was just born in, 45? Mm-hmm.
Oh, you missed Pathé News. That was the main news that you saw when you went to the theater. It was a short, it was always in a... Pathé, I believe, was a French company, I don't know. But that's when you saw the news in pictures. And every time you saw them, there was something about the Nazis. And America was not... At the time, they were isolationist. If they'd had a vote to go to war against Germany in 1940, there would have been no votes for it.
Mm-hmm.
The only guy that knew there was a war coming, Roosevelt did. And he tried to get the thing built up. And he did get it started a little bit. Theodore Roosevelt, but if the Japanese wouldn't have attacked us at Pearl Harbor, we probably would have never gotten in the war.
How long were you in the war?
Well, I actually joined the Marines in October 1942, but they didn't call me up till spring.
And then you went all the way through to the end of the war?
Yeah, I went through. I got discharged in 1946, in July the 11th, 1946. I thought about staying in, but then there were thousands of lieutenants, You know the ranks in Navy,
Mhm.
ensigns, AG, lieutenant. Well, there were 1,000 lieutenants, and they passed a rule, and I stayed in the reserve then. I was a navigation officer for the destroyer. It was based there, Everett, and you had to move along with your Annapolis counterpart. If he moved up the next rank, and you weren't given enough good reports to do that, you're out.
Mhm.
And of course, that wiped out a hell of a lot of the reserves. In the first place, they were the Annapolis guys had by far the best opportunity. I might say that during the war, I never saw an Annapolis officer. I never saw one.
Where do you think they were?
Home. They were back in an office in Washington, D.C. or Honolulu or someplace. When the war was over, and they were all just guys like me. They're like I don't know what our captain did. He was the lieutenant commander, but he was just like me, a reserve officer. Everybody on the ship were. But when the war was over, within a month or so, we got a four-striper, which is just like God in the Navy, as the captain. And of course, he was mad because it was a put-down for him. That's what they put him there for. See, he should have been in charge of a battleship or a carrier. And he was really pissed about it all. So he was nasty as hell. I don't think I ever spoke to him. He didn't care much about lieutenants. He didn't care much about anybody. And he always picked if a kid would drop something when the seaman, and he saw it, oh man, he'd give his officer hell for letting him do it. Of course, he didn't have any control over it. I tried to stay away from it as much as I could, and they pretty successful.
Probably most people did. Sounds. So you talked about the one landing and about sleeping on the pier.
Well,
what other things?
That was the only time where I was on. Although going out to the war, we went from Panama Canal, and it was a long ways out there. I think it took us 30 days to get there, to Okinawa. But when we went past the big Japanese naval base, we went pretty close there. I'd say within 50 miles of it. It was called Truk, T-R-U-K. It was their equivalent of Pearl Harbor. And we went past there at night. I remember out because a Japanese Betty, which was their main bomber, flew over us. And at night you can see the phosphorus in the water. That propeller on the ship turns up. It looks. You can look back there and you can see a bright light practically where the ship's going. You can't hide it. Submarine, I guess, could if they were underwater. We couldn't, and neither could Indian. And he flew over us, and pretty low. I'm guessing a couple thousand feet. Good bombing, right? But he didn't drop any bombs. And what we figured, he was probably out of them. See, they weren't big bombers. They were like one of our smaller. It wasn't a big bomber like the one Clyde was on. About half that time. About the size of the one Jimmy Doolittle flew over Japan. In that famous thing. Well, and we didn't shoot at him because we didn't want to open up a can of worms. And we had, plenty of aircraft guns on there. We had pretty big ones. And the biggest one was what they call 5-inch 38, shoots a shell about that big around, about that long. And then we had a whole lot of smaller ones about that big around, about that long. But we didn't fire. The only time we fired at Japanese planes was at Okinawa. And it got to where it was awful dangerous because there were hundreds of ships around there. Those bullets come down too. It got so bad when it was kamikaze, they were always flying over trying to pick off a troop ship or all the carriers were hit. They weren't. My ship was fairly safe from them because they would have to. That would be not the first time. They wanted to get a troop ship with 1,000 or 2 troops on it, or a warship, or particularly a carrier. They had a lot of carriers. We had maybe 100 small carriers, baby carriers they called them, but they carried fighter planes on them.
Mm-hmm.
That was they liked to get those too. Well, we were in close to the beach, close being maybe 300 yards, 3 football fields long from the beach. and we were shooting at those damn kamikaze, and then, but then you had to be careful because when they came in along, when you started to depress your guns, well, there might be a ship out there, so, and a couple of ships got hit, not by us, but by some other ship. Everybody was shooting, God, and the sky was just like 4th of July. So they issued an order, no more shooting from the ships, no more anti-aircraft shooting from the ships. The shore batteries, which were bigger guns, there was an army, and they shot bigger guns. And then they shot, and then they sent up P-38s. They were the kind of plane that they used to kill Admiral Yamamoto.
Could you tell which planes were the kamikaze pilots? Were they different kinds of planes, or just
They
started...
usually use like kind of obsolete fighter planes, or they would use anything.
So you really didn't know until it started coming low, or?
Well, they couldn't land. They didn't have any landing gear. They were made. You had to commit suicide. You had to drive that.
But
point.
from your ship, you couldn't tell if they were going to be a kamikaze.
Well, usually we could tell because they were going lower. And the other thing, they're going lower and slower. But there's another thing I forgot to tell you. We have what they call IFF. You know what that is? It stands for Identification Friend or Foe. And it's a little thing on the plane wing. And it comes back to our radar unit and says whether they're a friend or foe. So you could tell. And that's just by chance, maybe 1,000 to 1, that something went wrong with your equipment. But we could tell a Japanese plane ordinarily at least 25 miles away. If it got below the surface of the earth, you really can tell the difference. If a ship is out there 25 miles, you can't see it. It's below the curvature of the earth. But when the planes were usually, those kamikaze planes were usually coming in at maybe just a couple 100 feet up. So.
Did you ever see one hit?
Yeah, the ship they had us move to let the ship closer to the beach because we didn't necessarily carry troops. We just carried quick attack people, and so they moved us out about 600 yards. A troop ship came in to take our place so they'd be closer to unload the troops. And a kamikaze hit it right in the hole and killed about 400 troops. Because when they hit, it's like when they blow up those towers in New York, the plane is a bomb. That's what it is. And of course, that jelly that they use for fire bombs, it goes all over and starts fires all over. And ships aren't very good at putting out fires unless they're regular first-of-the-line warships like battleships and cruisers, because they got so much steel, bulletproof steel around them. We could stop a 50 caliber machine gun bullet, and that's all with our armor. If they had hit us anything bigger, it was going to go through it.
Is it true that the Japanese had trouble because they did not have fire training like the Americans had?
I'd heard that, but I don't know. But what they didn't have that killed them was they didn't have radar. See, we got it from England. Germany had it. Why they didn't give it to the Japanese, I don't know. But the Japanese, they had to see us in a plane. They couldn't. We could. When I was standing radar watches, they call them fire control watches. They're anti-aircraft watches on the ship. That's what they did. So you're up on the top of the ship and you have control of all the anti-aircraft guns. I can remember seeing Japanese planes out there 150 miles or more with radar. If they were up in the air, if they were up above the curvature of the earth, man, I could see them. And it would show, had a big screen about that. It looked like those old Bendix Weiss machines, big round screen. And there was a line ran across the middle of it. And when we could see them on that, see, it would show us a blip. And as it got, the machine measured how far it was from it, and it kept it closer, 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 and what direction it was going, and what height it was, and so forth like that. And of course, if it was one of ours, if it had that IFF on it, that blip went below that line across the middle. You could, so you didn't shoot your own plane. And this, like I was told you, when we were shooting anti-aircraft at Japanese planes too low, then you would hit other ships. So they had to cut that out.
Mm-hmm.
But the Japanese weren't going to win the war because of those kamikazes, but boy, they did a hell of a lot of damage. They,
How many did they use? I mean, how many?
how many did they? I would say that they probably sank a couple hundred, and they damaged way more than that. What they would do to a Navy ships is hit them in the conning tower, regular war life. Troop ships, they wanted to get down where the troops were in the hatches, down. And but in the fighting ships, they would hit them, want to hit them at the conning tower. That would knock out the controls and kill their higher ranking officers.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We had a great advantage over the Japanese, actually, except in fighter planes. In the beginning, their fighter planes were better. And as it went on, they had the same fighter planes, and we had those P-38s, which are a nightmare for everybody, for the Japanese. Because they were fast, and we had what were those? P-51. And they were fast. They would go 400 miles an hour. Well, see, up until then, fighter planes was about 200 miles an hour. But they were maneuverable. But we put those big engines in those P-51s and in the they call it P-38. That's what they were big like a bomber almost, but they were fighter planes. They had more than one guy. And
Now, did everybody get trained as to what the different types of planes and ships and all were, or was it something you just knew because of the times?
they didn't. I think they did in the planes. They had to, I'm sure. But they weren't complicated like now.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was telling, when I went aboard the last new carrier here in Norfolk, I think it was the Roosevelt. It was one of the biggies. It was brand new. But they had the trial runs, and they took us down below where the fighter planes are all set. And I look at the side, they have the names, of the pilot. And the lowest ranking one was the commander. Well, that would be the highest ranking. In our wars fought by young men.
Mm-hmm.
And they were low ranked. It was fought by lieutenants. I mean, as far as the officers are concerned, and ensign. But I could hardly believe the size of these planes. Of course, those planes are more expensive. They probably cost a couple $1 million. And they were high-ranking officers.
How old were you in the war?
When I joined the Marines, I was 20. I joined in the fall, and I was 20 in May. When I got to Okinawa, of course, I was a couple years older. It was kind of an interesting. My men were young. I don't think any of them were over 18. They probably lied. They were probably 17. I remember.
Because everybody wanted to go off.
Yeah, that's true. It's funny. We would go out on these maneuvers, which was usually involved. We had these heavy rafts. You probably said, what do they call those things? You could put an outboard motor on the back of them, but they were heavy duty rafts. They weighed 600 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
They were air, and we'd go out on those, and my 6-man crew would hold one end, and I'd hold the other. They were just little weak guys, and they would always talk about, God, can hardly wait to start killing those Japs, And I would say, well, my brother had been killed by then, and I said, it isn't that way. They don't hold still. They're going to kill you. I always kind of thought, in a way, I admired General Patton in one way. In World War I, he was a lieutenant or captain, low-ranking, and I guess when he had his first command there in France in World War I, he had these young green troops, and he called them to muster, and he said, we're here to fight the Germans, and you're going to get killed, and by God, I'm going to see you do. He laid it on the line, and they probably did. But I used to tell him, it isn't that way, because I thought I was an old man. I was like 22 or something. I think that's what I was.
And I'm sure they were more willing to do a lot of these things, or definitely more eager, but more willing to do stupid missions. Because
well, I was too, mostly because when you're young like that, you know that people are getting killed, but you think it's going to be somebody else. The only time I felt different when that Japanese Betty flew over. I was on that fire control. I looked out there and saw that, and I threw up. I didn't really throw up like this, but the stuff came up, you know. You don't be surprised how the thought of imminent death when you're conscious doesn't seem real like a good idea.
Yeah. Was it, and that's the only time that you felt like
Yeah.
that?
After that, I never bothered me a bit. Because lots of times I didn't. Like when we went in the next day, I had no idea we were in real danger.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of spooked from the fact we didn't see any Japanese, of course.
Or anybody else?
I guess it's my
That we didn't have to land on Japan. I really believe they'd have killed millions of Japanese and a million or more of us.
Why so?
Because they wouldn't surrender. I was in on some of the fighting in Saipan, not on invasion, but the Japanese were still there, and we couldn't get them to surrender at all. They would just commit suicide before they would surrender. And finally it got so bad, there's so many little caves around the cliffs and jungle, you couldn't hardly dig them out. We just set up a fence there and said, leave the Japs alone. They don't, they're running out of ammunition. One of my men, that's another side story I might bring up. One of my men, he was young, but he was big. He was probably 17. A Japanese abandoned a motorcycle, retreating into those caves, and it had a sidecar on it. It was a Japanese Harley Davidson. He was probably a runner, see, for the run, and so he grabbed it, and he was a mechanic. He had a motorcycle, so we took it back to the ship, put it on a landing boat, and took it back aboard the ship. The captain would have crapped. He kept everything from him, like the high ranking officer. Well, mostly just the captain. Those guys were different. And so he fixed it up. He was a good mechanic, and it was running great. And so the executive officer, who was medium grade, he was probably a lieutenant commander though too. He said, well, what are you going to do with that motorcycle? And I said, well, we use it for anything we need to do on the ship. He said, well, you know, I've been out here for a couple of years, and my clothes are all rotten off. In fact, during the war, usually the higher ranking officers wore khakis. You know, they looked kind of like army. Mm-hmm. And guys like me wore jungle greens. They were camouflage suits, you know. And they wouldn't let you wear anything but the insignia you had to be sort of hidden. Because they didn't want the snipers to know they were going to get they'd rather shoot a lieutenant than a private. And so he said, I need some new clothes better. And he said, the Air Force just opened a PX up on the plateau for B-29s. And the Seabees had bulldozed a road up that plateau. The road is about as wide as a Jeep, and it went up pretty steep. And so he said, you think it'll go up there? And I said, well, sure, a motorcycle. And so they had a sidecar on it, so I told my coxswain, the guy who was coxswain in the Navy, was like a corporal. I never really know how. I'm sure you guys living in Norfolk know.
We're more Navy.
Yeah. And so he says, okay, it's all ready to go. And as we got it off the landing boat, put it on the beach, ran right into my roommate at the University of Washington. He was a Navy officer too. And he said, where are you going? I told him. He said, well, how about going long? We had the sidecar, you know. See, yeah, he's sat in the sidecar. Then the kid driving the motorcycle. I was behind the kid in the motorcycle. And he became Senator Martin Durkin, this guy. But anyhow, on the way up, there was a little dip where it kind of went down, and there's a Jeep in front of us. God, it was a thing. You know, how could that happen? He stopped, dead. And you know, it's 1,000. Well, it's 100 feet down on this side, 100 feet straight up on that side. This bulldozed road, there's a cliff, you know. So we hit it. We couldn't help it. Well, we were close enough. We were far enough away. We could have stopped, but he put the foot on the brakes. No brakes. And I said, and it had a rocker shift like those Harley Davidson had. You could shift it down to low. I said, for Christ's sake, shift it down to low. He just went ballistic. He just threw his hands up and started hollering. And we were still, you know, and we hit the back of that damn Jeep, and I went clear over the Jeep and landed in front of it, tore all my clothes off, got it, because it was rock, you know. And he landed beside me, killed him. He hit on his head. And I looked over at him, and brains were popping out. Durkin went over the side and landed in those rocks, those sharp rocks. They climbed up. Pretty soon an army Jeep or truck came by, and they went down and picked Durkin up. He was down there maybe 15 feet, and you could see a rock sticking through this side, sticking through his lung about that far, and you could see the foam you get from a lung puncture, you know. And I thought he was dead for sure. So did everybody. I knew that Coxon was dead. And so they took us to the field hospital, and while we were there, everybody else in there were B-29 pilots, and crew had gotten burned. Their planes, you know, would catch fire a lot of times because they had to carry too much gas. And the priest came in, the chaplain, and he said, "Are any of you Catholics?" It happened the other two guys were, and I said, you know, I was really punchy. I knew who I was, and that's about all. I said, well, the dead one was clear, but he said, but I said, of course I thought Durkin was dead too. And I said, well, he is. I don't know if he is or not, but he's an Irish. It's when he has been my roommate. And so they gave him the last rites, of course, and eventually they put me back aboard the ship. And
What had happened to you? Was it just skin?
Well, yeah, just, God, I was just bare flesh sticking out here. It didn't do damage except pour this. See, I'd hit him. Being a football player saved my life. I knew how to fall. And that's the one thing, God, that Coxon mine, he just was screaming. And he was turning over and over, and he hit on his head. See, I didn't. I was rolled up in a ball.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, anyhow, I got aboard the ship, and of course, you recovered pretty fast. I was pretty good in a week or so. But you know what a provost marshal is, don't you? Well, he's the chief police officer in the service. He's the guy that comes around, and he came to me when I was in Hudson. What right did you to have that Japanese motorcycle? He said, somebody got killed in that, you know, and we're gonna. And I thought, oh Christ, I'm gonna get court-martialed. And so I said, well, the executive officer gave me orders to come up here and get him some uniform. Well, that satisfied him okay. But when I got aboard the ship and had time to do it, I knew Durkin's folks, him being my roommate, and I wrote him a letter telling him I was there when he died and all that stuff, and whatever happened. And came back after the war, and I'm out to the Naval Hospital there in Seattle, run into Durkin. He lived.
And he was there. And you said he was a senator?
He became a senator, yeah.
In Washington?
Yeah. God, I was the most surprised. Here's a guy I had written off and told these folks. Of course, by then they knew he was alive. It must have been quite a shock when I found out of course, I never knew again, because you're always moving out there in the war.
And he never went back. He just went home after that.
He's still in the hospital, see, even then. But he was on crutches. I got a broken leg, too, besides that. But we went out on a party that somebody gave. Probably, you know, because a lot of us there had been University of Washington students, Durkin and myself, for instance. Anyhow, we went to this party, and since we were still in the service, we were still in uniform, we were sitting there at the banquet, and I heard Durkin telling the story. They asked him how he got wounded. I heard him telling the story. It wasn't the same it wasn't at all, nothing.
He was a heat.
Well, he had hand-to-hand combat. And I quietly said when he got through, I said, Jim, that isn't the way it happened at all. Remember, I was there with you.
And what did he say?
Nothing. No, he did say, he said, is that really what happened? I think he believed that. Maybe, you know, it was like Goebbels.
It's one of those cases you tell it enough and it's true. It's
interesting. When he ran for governor eventually, after he was, and he, do you remember Dixie Lee Ray? Does that name ring anything? She was a woman governor she was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission for the United States. Well, she ran for governor in Washington and won. She beat him. But anyhow, in his his pamphlets that he handed out, they must have been written before he talked to me. Because it tells
Is that the
about
same
him getting
story?
wounded and getting the blue, red, or purple cross and all. Maybe he didn't believe me. I don't know.
The binoculars?
Well, when we went to Japan, 3 or 4 days before the peace treaty was to be signed, and they flew in the people who ran the world, like MacArthur and Nimitz and the big wheels. And then they met with the Prime Minister of Japan. What was it? Tojo, I think was his name. And they met on the Missouri, signed the peace treaty. They sent us. We were around there. We had to make sure the Japanese didn't have their big guns up. They're going to pick them off. We were scared to death. You couldn't trust them.
Mm-hmm.
After Pearl Harbor, we knew better to trust them. So I went ashore, and we had other people going ashore at different spots. And where I went ashore, it was a naval base there. And they went ashore in a landing boat. And fortunately, I had 2 machine gunners behind me. Because we didn't know. You remember the war was still going on, technically. A Japanese commander then came down to surrender to me. And I was just a Lieutenant JG then. But he probably didn't know. Well, he knew the difference. And he spoke English, but I got to come think of it. He was a pretty big Japanese, taller than me. But he was in full dress uniform. And of course I was in these dirty old jungle greens. And he had a pair of binoculars. Japanese binoculars. So I got to thinking, we won the war. I reached over, I took his binoculars off, put them on myself, and kept them. He never said a damn word. That was finally.
Do you still have them?
I fired when Gail and I got married, and we're moving. I sold them at a garage sale. He didn't get tired of it.
Oh.
I had a bunch of Japanese swords. They weren't good ones. They were military swords. They weren't carry swords. I did have one of those though, and I sold that. Those war things are okay for a while, but you get sick of that stuff, right?
Do you have anything that you kept?
I don't remember anything that I kept. One thing, it was kind of hard to, in the service part I was in, it was hard to get stuff. I had a Japanese rifle, and it shot hardwood bullets. It was a regular rifle like we would have for hunting deer. And so I was asking, what about? It shot regular bullets too, and they said, well, they ran out of bullets, running out of lead to make. So a lot of the close-in rifles, they used these harder, like oak bullets in them.
Huh.
Yeah, I have no idea whatever happened to those.
Do you have like your dog tags or anything?
Yeah. I have my Marine stuff and also my Navy stuff. I can remember, I told you I disliked the Marines. I thought they were stupid. Being a college graduate about, and most of these guys weren't. And not that there's any secret to that either, but it makes you think you are. Anyhow, we would, every morning when we had mustered in the Marine Corps, we had a warrant officers, lots of them in the Marine Corps, they're like halfway between an officer and an enlisted man, sort of. And he would call us to attention and then hold us there for about 5 minutes. And then he'd jump up in the air like the guy in the Toyota ads, and as he spun around, in fact, he'd turn around, he'd holler, "General MacArthur is a son of a bitch, and don't you guys ever forget it." And we had to do that. So we had to holler that. That went on for 6 months. I thought, God, this seemed like what they were trying to do, apparently. Apparently that's what the Marines do, those things. They're trying to get you to where, we got to where we thought everybody except Marines were a little bit almost like the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
We used to go out and pick fights with soldiers, just because they were soldiers. Mm-hmm. I didn't go much for that, though. I thought that was a dumb thing. But My Marine captain, good guy. He was the most decorated Marine, because he was always saving his enlisted men getting shot up. He was a hell of a guy, really. Because some of his non-commissioned officers served under him. See, there too, where he kind of brought those guys with him, or was able to. And they just loved the guy. But I liked him too. I really liked him. But I went in to tell him that I wanted my commission in the Navy.
He didn't like that too much.
And my God, whatever for? And I told him, I said, you know, my brother just gotten killed in the Navy, and so forth, and I feel really an allegiance to the Navy. He said, well, okay, but you're making a mistake. I wasn't making a mistake. It was about the time they were killing those lieutenants, like 5 in the Marine Corps. Well, after the war, well, I stopped to see him in New York one time. He became a minister, Episcopal. He was the Archbishop of New England. If you've been in New York, the big cathedral is St.
Patrick's.
No, that's Catholic.
Oh, that's right.
I think it's at St. John's, isn't it, the big cathedral? I think
don't
it's St.
remember.
John. It's a huge, well, that's where his home station would be, you know, as the Archbishop of New York,
Wow.
or New England. I went to some Marine reunions, because a lot of those guys were my friends. We hauled some of them. At Okinawa, we hauled some of my friends. They were Marine lieutenants. I remember saying goodbye.
It's kind of weird how you ran into Burton, and you ran into
Yeah, the Stanley ship.
Stanley and the guy from Washington.
It is. We hauled at least 2 Marine officers in that were in my officer training program, and one guy who had been in who flunked. And he was what was the equivalent of CB. The Marines call them pioneers. And they do the unloading the ships and that sort of stuff. One of the guys we hauled into Okinawa, though, they were both the 2 good friends of mine. They were sitting on an ammunition box. They'd driven the Japanese pretty much off the southern end of the island. And they were congratulating themselves after living through that. Just then, one hit him in the side of the head, a sniper gun, and it plowed down. It didn't penetrate the brain. It plowed down, here. The sniper might have been quite a ways away, and the other one just a direct hit killed. So don't congratulate her.
Yeah. Now, you were talking about him being decorated. That reminded me. I know we have, Clyde got the Purple Heart and the Distinguished Flying Cross, and there's other ones. Do you know what
The other ones are the particular action that he would have been in. Like he would have gotten one for that out in Natal, the battle flag. It didn't have one with a star on it.
I don't remember.
they're all framed at.
They're all framed.
They're all
but
framed at
Yeah,
Dad's
I don't know
house.
like myself, like on the I got a star on the landing at Okinawa. There's a star on my battle flag, and then I got one for being assigned to Chad. It's from the Chinese Army for a Chinese occupation medal, I suppose it would be, and then I got one for the Japanese occupation medal, and I got I think I showed it to your husband, the UGT. It's a funny looking medal. It's long like an airplane wing sort of. It's that pewter colored, and then it's got a firearm on it and a trident. Tridents with the Navy submarine. It's because it involved those types of activities. And then whatever area ones that you'd be in, like what theater of war, but those represent what areas you were in.
Okay.
Stanley would have been the one that would have had the battle flag. Jesus, I don't know. He died soon enough afterwards. I never really got to see Stanley much after the war. Of course, he always wanted, when he tried to re-enlist, he was in there long enough to retire from the Navy. He tried to re-enlist and they found he had a heart murmur, so he couldn't re-enlist. But he'd always wanted to be an engineering officer on a civilian ship, you know. And he became the engineering officer on the Mobile tanker. And they were hauling oil from Alaska oil fields to Los Angeles. And his second trip down there, they stopped at Tacoma, which is maybe 15 miles away from where I lived there. Oh, it's 25 miles. And phoned, and Irene happened to be there, so we made an appointment with him for dinner. So we went down there, picked him up off the ship, we all went to dinner. And he got a heart attack and died on the way out. He left there and went to Los Angeles, and they wondered why he didn't report to watch. They could go down to his room and he's dead. So I did get to see him right at the end. I didn't of course, a heart attack, die anytime. Tomorrow.
So he was just still in the service for so long that he was being moved around from place to place and whatnot.
It happened. Of course, I got that stuff from your dad, mostly. He sent me that stuff from Stanley's ship. He was in at least 11 battles. And he looked every bit of it, too. I think he took it okay. Burton would have killed him, I'm sure, because Burton emotionally was, I think, seeing that camper that killed the Jews and him shooting that German, I think the German was just a kid.
A kid like 18.
14 or 15, something like that. Well, anyhow, he took it very hard. And Clyde's action was a short period of time, but deadly.
How long was he in the war before he died, Clyde?
Well, see, he joined in 1938. So, but he was in the surface war. He was on the same ship Stanley was at Pensacola. And then when he applied for flight training, so they sent him to they sent him first to Seattle, to that air base there. And then from there he went to, when I was going to the University of Idaho, he would try to come down to the football games, which is maybe 80 miles away. But then he got sent to Norfolk. And that would have been the fall of 1940. And then he met Hortense about that time. They married him maybe a few months later, didn't they?
They didn't date very long at all.
Yeah.
They got married on New Year's Day.
Yeah, so you see, that was, and of course he was in until he got killed, which was on August 11th, 1943.
43.
Okay. I was going to say, wait a minute.
Yeah.
And Grandma told us the story of that, and I should probably get her to tell it about how the Western Union telegram people just rode their bikes up and handed you a piece of paper to inform you that you had lost someone.
Yeah, there were so many people getting killed. They did before send an officer out to talk to you. But by the time Clyde got killed, there were so damn many. They'd changed the picture. I found out Hortense sent me a telegram, and I was in the Marines, and I got that. But the telegram said that he was missing in action, and so I thought he was captured. Probably didn't know, of course, he was dead. When I did find that out, of course, my mother always thought he was probably captured. She never realized he was dead. She may have known he was dead, but failed to accept it.
Another interesting thing that I saw of Grandma, she had notes that Clyde had written her during the war, and the censor read all the notes and cut holes out that would indicate where you were and like that, cut words out.
I used to have to do that, see.
You were part of it. You were a censor?
Well, all the officers had to do it. See, the enlisted men in your group had to give their letters to you unopened, and you read them and cut out. I just sealed them, so I never read it. Most of my friends never did either. Let me tell you, I think that was bullshit. I know they had to do it, and I used to hate it because that meant or at least once a week, you spent hours reading those if you really did it. And Tokyo rose no more about it. There used to be a Japanese woman get on the radio, you know, we could listen to her. And that's how we found out the news. You know, she told where every ship was and what every action was. And I'm sure it was that way. They had Axis Sally was her name. She did the same thing for the German. It's kind of interesting. One of the enlisted men, you know, they would write letters just like you told what a son of a bitch the captain was. He read that. How unlucky the poor guy. Like I say, most of the officers never read it. They just initially had an initial. That's it. And the captain was mad. He called a ship to everybody to come up, and he said, "Do you know what one of your crew did? Let me read you this." I thought that was terrible. I got along good with the enlisted men because they stole 2 cases of beer and gave to me. In my bed in my stateroom, there was about that much room under the mattress, and then there was a steel pan, you know, because that's where all those officer beds. They stole and gave me enough beer to fill that thing up. And you took the fire extinguishers, you know, and sprayed them on that froze the beer, and you could have cold beer. Of course, they gave me the beer because I would rat on it.
That's a new college trick with the fire extinguisher.
Is that right?
No, I don't know. I've never heard of it before.
Yeah,
No.
that's what we use the fire extinguisher all the time. You just freeze them as cold as you want. We,
Hold on. Now we're back on. I know, we're really right back.
I was answering the phone, so I'm turning.
I might talk to you about that.
Okay.
Because it probably isn't really well known, you know, among your relatives here. But when I was a senior in high school, the war went on, of course. And so I had 2 roommates. We rented this house, this town right close to Pontiac, because there was no public high school. 27 miles away was the first closest public high school. So we rented this little house, the 3 of us. And when we graduated, one of them joined the Navy immediately, got on Arizona and got killed, of course. And then the other guy and I, we waited maybe 2 or 3 months, and then went and joined what we thought was the Navy. Okay, but I was too young. They wouldn't let me in. I was probably 17, and he wasn't though. He was probably 18 or 19. So I had to take my papers home to have my dad sign them, and I took my papers up to the ranch. They lived on a ranch then in Idaho, and he signed them, and then the mail came that same day. You'd only get the mail every 2 or 3 days, you know, it wasn't delivered to your house. And inside it said, from the football coach, college football coach, said, "We're prepared to offer you a full scholarship. Play football here and there." So I thought, I never even thought about it. Because nobody in my family had gone to college. My mother went 1 year, but that was 1905 or something. So I thought, well, that beats hell out of going in the service. So that's what I did. I didn't send the papers back. And the other, of course, he was old enough, he didn't have to. And he was really mad at me, of course. But anyhow, so then the college was Lewis Clark College, State College. And so I played football there that year for him on the scholarship. But it's great. You got room, board, books, and tuition. The only thing you had to have was money for recreation or clothes or something. You just wore the same clothes. Well, anyhow, then as a result of that was a community college, by the way. I didn't say that. And so then the University of Idaho, which was a regular 4-year institution, we were in the same conference with Stanford and Washington and Southern Cal in those days. Usually got beat. But anyhow, then he came down and said, the athletic director, and said, "We're prepared to offer you a full scholarship at the University of Idaho." And I would be eligible because that was a community college. And I'd be a sophomore then at the university. So then I went to the University of Idaho on a full scholarship. And that,
You were playing lineman and
I was a linebacker and a
linebacker.
guard.
Okay.
On defense, I played a linebacker. Yeah. And I had been a fullback, but I was fast enough. But they thought, well, little guys are fast. So usually, guys who weighed 160 pounds. Anyhow, it didn't make any difference. That's what they chose, and you had to do what they. And I was on the boxing team and the track team. And in those days, you know, boxing in college was a national sport. They had an NCAA championship every year, and Idaho won it 2 or 3 years. They would recruit really good guys. 2 of our best were off the Olympic teams. They won the Olympics. And they were Hungarians. We brought them all over from Hungary. Well, anyhow, then in the spring of the year, they had a committee that the presidents of those 10 universities decided that the athletic departments were not being controlled enough. That they wanted, so they hired a retired FBI officer to look into it and manage, see, were these guys really going to college, where they work. In those days the rule was you had to work an hour for each $5 that you got in your scholarship. Well, when you're a student, if you go to class, and I was a student, and a football player, there's no way in hell that you could work an hour a day or something. So I traded with the basketball player who had the same problem, and he worked in my place. And then in the fall, in the winter, I worked in his place. Well, this FBI skunk they got, he came around to all the schools, and most of them were pretty sophisticated compared to the University of Idaho, and they probably beat the system. Well, when he looked on my record, it shows that I was working under the name of the basketball player. So they took my scholarship away. They took 6 of us from the University of Idaho. They did that too, and about the same number from Oregon State College. We were the 2 smallest universities in the conference. They didn't take anybody away from, say, Stanford or University of Southern California or University of Washington. They didn't look, hell, they were probably much more rampant, you know. And but that was politics. So I didn't want to get drafted. I knew, God, I had to sign up for the draft because I was 18. And so I signed up for the draft, and I was kind of desperate. You had to be in school, you know, in university or something like that. So my freshman coach had moved. Oh, he was a Mormon, and he had gone to University of Utah and was in the athletic department. So he told me, he said, well, we'll give you a scholarship to go to University of Utah, play football. Well, why not? I knew I didn't want to get drafted. I've got to get these letters from Clyde and Stanley, for Christ's sake. So anyhow, I went to University of Utah, and our first game was against Colorado, which was our big team. And see, I had to go someplace where they wouldn't know me. I couldn't go to the coast schools because they would know I'd been. And once you've gone to a 4-year school in that conference, you're not eligible to transfer.
I didn't know that. Is it still like that?
Yeah. The reason for that is, of course, the rich schools would get all the players. So anyhow, going to the University of Utah, because they didn't play any games in the Northwest. They played Colorado and Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska, schools like that. So I go there, and the school hadn't started. You always start football practice